I overheard my husband on the phone. "Don't worry, my wife has no idea I've been planning this for years." He hung up smiling. I smiled too, because I'd been planning twice as long, and the next morning when he woke up, he screamed. What he saw made him beg for mercy. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment from which part of the world you are watching. Get comfortable and relax. Let's begin. I was in the hallway, holding a vase of hydrangeas I had just cut from the garden, when my husband's voice carried from his study. The door was not fully closed. A slant of late afternoon sun fell across the wooden floor, warm on my feet. I was deciding on the placement of the blooms when his words, clear and jovial, stopped me. "Relax, it's all set," he was saying. "The final pieces are moving next week. Don't worry, my wife has no idea I've been planning this for years." The vase was cool and smooth in my hands. The water inside it was very still. I did not move. I listened to the tone of his voice, a sound I had known for 3 decades. It was the tone he used with his golf friends, with his business associates, confident, conspiratorial, smug. It was not a tone he ever used with me. "She's in her own world," he continued, and I could picture his dismissive wave of the hand. "Gardening, her charity committee, she's content. She won't see it coming. By the time she realizes, I'll be on a plane and the accounts will be just where I need them. 30 years is a long time to be patient." A bird called outside the window. I watched the light shift on the floorboards. I counted my heartbeats. They were steady. "The house, please. She can have the house. It's a wait. The equity is already redirected. Let her keep her trinkets and her rose bushes." He laughed then, a short, sharp sound. "No, it's not cruel. It's business. It's finally claiming what's mine after all this time carrying dead weight." I heard the creak of his leather desk chair. The conversation was winding down. "Next Thursday. Yes, I'll signal when it's done. Then we open the new chapter." There was a final murmur, a goodbye. I took a quiet, deep breath. I turned my head and looked at the closed door. My face felt like porcelain. I had practiced that stillness for many years. The study door opened. Robert emerged, his phone still in his hand. He saw me standing there, and his expression did not change. There was no guilt, no flicker of alarm. There was only the bland, habitual affection of a man who believes he is looking at a piece of familiar furniture. "Elle," he said, smiling. He slipped the phone into his pocket. "Those are nice, from the east bed." "Yes," I said. My voice was even. It did not shake. "I thought they would brighten the hallway." "Lovely." He stepped forward and patted my shoulder as he passed. His touch was absent, a gesture performed 1,000 times. He smelled of his aftershave and the scotch he kept in his desk drawer. "I've got to run out. Meeting with Tim about the Cartwright project. Don't wait on dinner if I'm late." "Of course," I said. He walked down the hall, took his keys from the bowl on the console table, and left. The front door closed with a solid, respectful click. The house settled into silence. I stood there for a full 5 minutes. I placed the vase carefully on the console table. I adjusted a stem. I watched the light fade from gold to a softer amber. I observed the details of my surroundings, the pattern in the rug, the dust motes in the sunbeam, the faint scent of the flowers mixing with the lemon polish I used on the wood. Then I walked to the kitchen. My steps were measured. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. I took out a single cup and saucer. I selected a tea bag peppermint for clarity. I performed each action with deliberate care. As the water heated, I leaned against the counter and looked out at my garden. The hydrangeas were still plentiful. The roses were in their second bloom. The peace lily by the back fence was thriving. I had planted every single thing out there. I knew every root structure, every feeding schedule, every pruning need. Robert saw a garden. He saw a hobby for a contented wife. He never saw the strategy in it, the patience, the constant observation of conditions and the adjustment of plans. He never understood that a garden is not passive. It is a long, quiet campaign. The kettle whistled. I poured the water over the tea bag. The steam rose in a warm cloud. So he had been planning for years. He thought his patience was a virtue. He thought his secrecy was a masterstroke. He believed my world was small and simple, bounded by flower beds and grocery lists. I carried my cup to the small kitchen table and sat down. I took a sip. The mint was clean and sharp on my tongue. I knew about the Cartwright project. It was not a real estate deal. It was the code name he and his friend Tim used for their side investments, the ones he thought I knew nothing about. I had known about it for 4 years, 7 months, and approximately 12 days. I knew about the redirected equity. I had seen the preliminary paperwork in his briefcase 2 months ago. I had photographed it. I knew about the flight he would not take next Thursday. I knew because I had accessed his email and changed the confirmation number 3 days prior. He had been planning for years, but I, Eleanor Montgomery, had been planning for longer. My plan did not involve running. It did not involve stealing. It involved reclaiming. It involved roots so deep he could not fathom them. I finished my tea. I washed the cup and saucer and put them away. I walked back to the hallway and straightened the vase of hydrangeas by 1/4 of an inch. Then I went to the garden shed. Robert never entered the shed. He disliked the smell of earth and fertilizer. He called it my little sanctuary. That was correct, but not in the way he meant. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of peat moss and old wood. Tools hung in neat rows. Bags of soil were stacked. On a shelf near the back was a large, healthy peace lily in a ceramic pot. It was heavy. I moved the pot to the side. Beneath it on the wooden shelf was a small, fingerprint-smudged metal panel. I pressed the corner. It clicked open, revealing a keypad. I entered a 6-digit number, the date of my mother's birthday, not Robert's, not our anniversary. A small, fireproof safe box, bolted to the shelf below, unlocked with a soft hum. I opened it. There were no jewels inside. There was a single, leather-bound ledger. I opened it. Page after page of my neat, precise handwriting documented every discrepancy, every hidden account, every secret transaction I had discovered over the past 8 years. There were notes on his conversations, copies of altered documents, and a step-by-step outline of my own strategy, titled simply, The Reclamation. I traced a finger over the last entry made the previous week. It read, Phase 1 complete, await trigger. The trigger had just happened in the sun-drenched hallway. I closed the ledger. I closed the safe. I moved the piece lily back into its exact place, its leaves hiding the panel once more. I left the shed and locked it behind me. The evening air was mild. I looked at our house. It was a handsome house. I had made it a home. Soon it would be mine alone, and it would no longer be a weight. It would be a testament. I went inside. I would cook dinner for myself. I would eat it in the quiet dining room. I would sleep in my own bed. And in the morning, I would call Beatrice. The quiet campaign was over. The active reclamation had begun. The morning after the hallway, I rose at my usual time, 6 o'clock. Robert was still asleep, his breathing a steady rhythm from his side of the bed. I dressed in my gardening clothes, a worn pair of trousers, a simple linen shirt, and went downstairs. I made a pot of coffee, filling only my own travel mug. The routine was a shield. Every normal action was a layer of insulation between the quiet fact in my mind and the world outside. I took my coffee to the garden shed. The sky was a soft gray, promising sunlight later. Inside the shed, the air was cool and familiar. I did not go directly to the peace lily. Instead, I busied myself for 20 minutes, checking the moisture of the bagged soil, wiping down tool handles, organizing seed packets. It was a habit of caution, a lifetime of not rushing. Finally, when I was certain the house was still quiet, I moved the heavy pot. The safe opened with the same soft hum. I removed the ledger and brought it to the small, scarred work table under the window. The morning light was enough to read by. I opened the book to the first page. The earliest entry was dated 8 years, 4 months ago. It read, Noted discrepancy in quarterly investment statement. Account 7044 shows a withdrawal of $15,000 marked portfolio rebalancing. No corresponding deposit in any joint holding. Filed statement in blue folder 3. I turned the page. The entries were chronological, precise. They were not emotional. They were a log. Overheard phone call with Tim Ray. Cartwright Venture. Initial research indicates shell company registration in Delaware. Robert stated he was locking in a financial future for us. Pressure to sign refinance papers for beach property. Declined, citing headache. Papers copied before returning to his office. Found secret credit card statement in golf bag. Charges for hotel in Charleston, flights to Nassau. Single occupancy. Confirmed link between shell company and our home equity line of credit. Initiated secondary savings protocol. The secondary savings protocol was my own method. For years, a small, automatic transfer moved money from our joint household account into an account in my name only. The amount was modest, something I could explain as a budgeting error or a bank glitch if ever questioned. It was funded by grocery savings, refunds, and the deliberate underreporting of costs for home projects I managed myself. Over 8 years, it had grown. Robert saw only the outflow from the main accounts, which he controlled. He never saw the quiet accumulation in the shadow account because he never looked at the domestic ledgers I kept for groceries and utilities. He considered that work beneath his notice. The ledger was not just a financial record. It was a timeline of disengagement. A note from 5 years ago, our 25th anniversary. He gave me pearl earrings, same as our 20th. Receipt in pocket showed purchase the same day. He forgot my favorite flower is not lily of the valley, but peony. Another from 3 years ago. Suggested trip to Maine, where we honeymooned. He said the climate was bad for his sinuses. 2 weeks later, he booked a golf trip to Arizona with Tim. I turned to the final section. Here, the notes shifted from observation to strategy. The heading read, The Reclamation Contingency Phases. Phase 1, Financial Isolation. This involved the methodical identification and separation of all assets I could legally claim or protect, including the secret savings, my inherited jewelry I had documented as separate property, and my half of the pension based on my own career contributions before I left work. It listed the lawyer I had preliminarily researched, a woman named Ms. Jenkins, known for her work with women in long-term marriages. Phase 2, Legal Fortification. This phase detailed the steps to secure my position once the trigger event occurred. It involved the official hearing of the lawyer, the freezing of specific joint accounts using the evidence I had gathered, and the filing of certain protective motions. It was a list of actions, each with a code beside it. P for prepared, R for ready, E for executed. Phase 3, Physical Reclamation. This was the briefest section but the most definitive. It contained a single line item, the house and its contents, assessment and removal protocol. Next to it, I had written a name, B. I closed the ledger. The coffee in my mug was cold. I looked out the shed window at my garden. The roots of the hydrangeas I had cut yesterday ran deep, established over a decade. They would return next year stronger. Robert's plan was a weed, shallow and hastily grown. Mine was an older, slower-growing tree. He intended to chop it down. He did not realize I had already transplanted it to safer ground years ago. I returned the ledger to the safe, sealed it, and replaced the peace lily. I finished my cold coffee. Back in the kitchen, I heard Robert moving upstairs. I began preparing breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice. When he came down, he was dressed for work. Morning, he said, heading straight for the coffee maker. He frowned. You didn't make a full pot. I thought you had an early meeting, I said, cracking an egg against a bowl. I didn't want it to sit and get bitter. He grunted, pouring the remains of my pot into his cup. Right, the Cartwright thing might be a long day. I understand, I said, whisking the eggs. Take your time. He ate quickly, scanning his phone. He did not look at me. Those hydrangeas look nice in the hall, he said, as an afterthought. Thank you, I said. He stood, taking his plate to the sink. He patted my shoulder, the same absent gesture. Don't wait up if I'm late again. This is a complex phase. I nodded, wiping the counter. I hope it goes as you've planned. He smiled, a tight, self-satisfied curve of his mouth. It will. I've laid the groundwork perfectly, years of work coming to fruition. He left. The house was quiet again. I cleared his place setting and washed the dishes. Then, I went to the living room, picked up the phone, and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice. B's Cafe, a warm, brisk voice answered. B, I said. It's Elle. Are you able to take a break this morning? I need to come by. I need to show you my garden plans. There was a slight pause on the line. B understood the code. Garden plans meant something serious. Of course, honey, come now. The breakfast rush is over. I'll put the kettle on. I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said. I hung up. I went upstairs and changed from my gardening clothes into a simple, neat dress. I collected my handbag. From the shed, I retrieved the ledger, placing it in a large, plain tote bag. It had weight. It was the weight of 8 years of silence. Today, I would break that silence with the only person who had ever truly listened. The active reclamation required a witness. It required a friend. The bell above the door of B's cafe gave a familiar, cheerful jingle. The air inside was warm and smelled of coffee, cinnamon, and baking bread. B was behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine. She looked up, and her expression shifted from professional welcome to immediate concern. She saw the tote bag in my hand, my posture, the careful neutrality of my face. "Give me 2 minutes," she said, her voice low. She called out to a young woman stocking cups. "Maya, hold the fort, I'll be in the back." I nodded and walked past the few occupied tables to the rear of the cafe. A door marked private led into B's small office and kitchenette. It was a cluttered, comforting space. Recipe books were stacked on a shelf. A small table with 2 chairs was pushed against the wall. A kettle was already steaming on the hot plate. B came in, closing the door behind her. She didn't speak. She simply wrapped me in a firm, quick hug. She smelled like vanilla and coffee grounds. Then she released me, her hands on my shoulders, her eyes searching mine. "How bad?" "It's time," I said. She nodded once, a sharp, understanding gesture. "Sit." She turned and busied herself with 2 ceramic mugs, dropping peppermint tea bags into each. She poured the hot water and brought the mugs to the table, sitting across from me. Her gaze was steady. "Start from the beginning, today's beginning." I took a sip of the tea. The heat was a grounding point. Yesterday afternoon, I was in the hallway with the hydrangeas. He was on the phone in his study. The door was ajar. I repeated Robert's words to her, verbatim. I kept my voice flat, reciting them as if reading from a transcript. When I got to the part about dead weight, B's mouth tightened into a thin line. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her mug. "The bastard," she said, the word a soft, sharp exhale. "The absolute smug bastard," she shook her head. "And you just stood there." "I stood there," I confirmed. "He came out. He patted my shoulder. He told me not to wait up for dinner. He left for a meeting about the Cartwright project." I said the name with deliberate clarity. B's eyes narrowed. She knew that name from our past conversations, from my vague mentions of his side ventures. "So it's happening next week." "According to him, but he is operating on outdated information." I set my mug down. I reached into the tote bag and pulled out the ledger. I placed it on the table between us. The worn leather cover looked innocuous. "This is why." B looked at the book, then at me. "What is this, Elle?" "My insurance policy," I said. "Started 8 years ago." I opened the ledger to the first page. I let her read the initial entry. I saw her eyes scan the neat columns, the dates, the cold facts. She turned a few pages, her movements slow. She read an entry about the secret credit card, another about the refinance papers. She absorbed the evidence of systematic deception, not as a shocked wife, but as a methodical archivist. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, but not with tears, with a fierce, ignited understanding. "You knew all this time." I suspected, then I confirmed, then I documented, I said. He believed my quietness was ignorance, it was observation. B leaned back in her chair, letting out a long, controlled breath. She looked at me with a new appreciation. "You've been at war, and none of us knew." "It wasn't a war until he declared it," I said. "It was just preparedness. Now it's reclamation." I turned to the back section, to the outlined phases. "My plan is already in motion. It has been for years. But the active phase requires a second person. It requires you." "Tell me," she said without hesitation. "Phase 1 is largely complete. The financial isolation. I have my own assets secured. Phase 2 is legal fortification. That begins today. I need to retain a lawyer and file preliminary motions to freeze the vulnerable joint accounts. I have a name. I pointed to the entry for Ms. Jenkins. Your nephew, the one at the law firm, does that connection still hold? B nodded. Martin, he's a paralegal there now. He said she's the best and she's discreet. She understands situations like this. Good, I would like an introduction, today if possible. I'll call him the second we're done here, B said. She looked back at the ledger. And Phase 3, physical reclamation, the house and its contents. She met my eyes. You mean to take it all? I mean to take what is mine. Every piece of furniture I chose. Every painting I loved. Every rug, every lamp, every book. He thinks he's giving me a weight. He's giving me back my life piece by piece. I intend to accept it. A slow smile spread across B's face. It was a smile of pure, undiluted solidarity. He'll come home to an empty shell. He will, I said, but I will need help. Logistics, storage, a place for the items to go before I secure a new residence. I cannot use commercial movers he might trace. B's mind was already working. I could see it. My brother-in-law has a warehouse unit. He owes me a favor, a big one. We can use it. My van. We can do it in stages, small loads. He's never home on Thursdays, is he? Golf league. Correct, I said. Her immediate practicality was a balm. Then we start this Thursday, B said. Small, non-essential items first. The silverware, the linens, the art from the guest room will build up to the big pieces. By the time he realizes what's happening, there will be nothing left to fight for. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her grip was strong and warm. You are not alone in this, Alina, not for a single second. I placed my other hand over hers. The simple human contact, after so long in calculated isolation, threatened to undo my composure. I did not let it. I held onto the resolve instead. Thank you, B. Don't thank me yet, she said, squeezing my hand before letting go. Thank me when we're drinking champagne in your new living room, surrounded by all your things. Now, she stood, taking our empty mugs to the sink. You stay here. I'm going to call Martin right now. You'll have an appointment with Ms. Jenkins by this afternoon. She left the room, closing the door softly behind her. I sat at the table, my hands resting on the closed ledger. The hum of the cafe was a muffled, living sound through the wall. I was no longer in a silent hallway holding a vase of flowers. I was in a warm room with a friend, a plan, and a path forward. The quiet campaign was over. The collaboration had begun. I allowed myself a single, small breath that was not entirely steady. Then I straightened my spine. I had lists to make. I took a notepad from B's desk and began to write. Item 1, call Ms. Jenkins. Item 2, secure storage unit. Item 3, begin inventory for Thursday. The work was no longer secret. It was shared. It was real. B's call to her nephew was successful. An appointment with Ms. Jenkins was set for 3 o'clock that same afternoon. I returned home from the cafe with 2 hours to prepare. The house was empty. Robert would be at his office, finalizing the details of his own betrayal. I went to my bedroom and opened my closet. I selected a suit I had not worn in several years, a tailored, cream-colored linen blend. It was simple, elegant, and spoke of a formality I rarely needed in my current life. I dressed carefully, fastening pearl buttons at the cuff. I styled my silver-gray hair into a neat twist. I applied a minimal amount of makeup, just enough to look polished. I studied my reflection in the mirror. I needed to look like a woman who understood contracts, not just casseroles. I retrieved the ledger from the tote bag. From its pages, I extracted the most critical documents I had copied over the years. I did not take the originals. Those were still hidden in Robert's files where he believed them safe. I took clear, legible photocopies. I organized them in a new, plain folder. The secret credit card statements, the bank transfers to the shell company, the email printouts about the Cartwright project, and the refinance papers with my forged signature attempt. I included a summary sheet, typed years ago and updated periodically, that drew a clear line between his actions and my financial vulnerability. I placed the folder in a structured leather briefcase I had inherited from my father. It was worn but dignified. At 2:15, I left the house. I drove myself downtown. The office of Jenkins and Lowe was in a quiet, brick-faced building, not the flashiest tower, but one with an air of established competence. The reception area was cool and quiet. A young man at the front desk, who I presumed was Martin, gave me a small, recognizing nod before speaking. "Mrs. Montgomery, Ms. Jenkins is ready for you, right this way." He led me down a carpeted hallway to a corner office. The room had large windows overlooking a small park. The walls were lined with legal books. A woman in her early 60s with close-cropped gray hair and sharp, observant eyes stood up from behind a large, tidy desk. She wore a dark blue suit. She did not smile, but her expression was not unfriendly. It was assessing. "Alina Montgomery, please have a seat." Her voice was calm and clear. "Martin has given me a brief context. Why don't you tell me in your own words what brings you here today?" I sat in the chair opposite her, placing the briefcase on my lap. "My husband of 30 years is planning to abscond with the majority of our marital assets next week. He believes I am unaware. I have been aware for approximately 8 years. I have come to you to legally secure my position and prevent that outcome." Ms. Jenkins leaned back slightly, steepling her fingers. "I see. That is a direct summary. You say you have proof of this plan and of your long-term awareness." "I do." I opened my briefcase and handed her the folder. "This contains documented evidence of financial diversion, intent to deceive, and preparation for abandonment. The primary evidence of the immediate plan is auditory, from yesterday, but the paper trail establishes a pattern." She opened the folder and began to read. Her eyes moved quickly across the pages. She did not react with visible shock or sympathy. She processed the information with a professional detachment that I found deeply reassuring. She asked occasional, precise questions. "This transfer dated last April. The destination account is in the name of a shell company named Cartwright Holdings, registered in Delaware. I have the registration documents here, behind the bank statement. And this line of credit application, the signature. A forgery. My real signature is on the card behind it for comparison. I never saw this document." She read for another 10 minutes in silence, occasionally making a note on a legal pad. Finally, she closed the folder and looked at me. "This is exceptionally well organized, Mrs. Montgomery. It demonstrates foresight. Your goal is to secure your financial future and remain in the marital home." "My goal is reclamation," I said, my voice even. "I wish to secure all assets that are rightfully mine, including my share of the marital property. I wish to freeze the joint accounts he intends to drain. I wish to file for legal separation based on financial misconduct and constructive abandonment. And I wish to do it now, before he executes his plan, so that when he attempts to act, he finds the doors already locked." Ms. Jenkins gave a slow, single nod. "That is actionable. Based on this documentation, I can file an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order to freeze the specified joint accounts and the home equity line. We can also file a notice of lease pendens on the house, clouding the title so it cannot be sold or refinanced without your knowledge. This will be a preliminary action. A full separation agreement will follow." "That is acceptable," I said. "There is the matter of retainer," she said. I opened my briefcase again. I withdrew a cashier's check from my secret savings account, made out to Jenkins and Lowe. I had prepared it a month ago when my internal timeline suggested the trigger was near. I slid it across the desk. "Will this suffice?" She looked at the amount and raised an eyebrow. "More than suffice. You are thorough." "I have had time to prepare," I said. "So I see." She placed the check to the side. "I will have the papers drawn up immediately. We will file first thing tomorrow morning. By close of business tomorrow, the financial restraints will be in effect. He will be unable to move the money. I must advise you that once we file, he will be served notice. He will know you have taken action." "I understand," I said. "That is part of the plan." "Very well." She stood and I followed suit. She extended her hand. I shook it. Her grip was firm. "I will be in touch tomorrow with the filing numbers. In the meantime, do not alert him. Go about your normal routine." "That is my intention," I said. I left her office. Martin was not at the front desk. I walked out into the afternoon sunlight. The air felt different. It was not a feeling of relief, but of a key turning in a heavy lock. The first legal barrier was now being constructed. The system I had studied for years was now actively working for me. I drove home. I changed out of my suit and hung it back in the closet. I put on my ordinary clothes. I went to the kitchen and began preparing ingredients for dinner, a chicken stew, something that could simmer for hours, requiring occasional mundane attention. The routine was my camouflage. As I chopped onions, I reviewed the steps in my mind. The legal machinery was engaged. Tomorrow, the first visible ripple would appear in Robert's pond. He would sense a snag. He would not yet understand it was a net. I set the pot to simmer. I wiped down the counters. Then, I went to the living room and took a small, framed photograph from the bookshelf. It was a picture of a peony from my garden. I placed it in a box I had started in the guest room closet. It was the first item on my inventory list for Thursday. The physical reclamation had begun, one silent, deliberate object at a time. The box in the guest room closet gradually filled with non-essential items over the next 2 days. A set of crystal candlesticks from my grandmother, a collection of art books, small porcelain figurines I had inherited. Each item was wrapped in tissue paper and placed neatly in the box. I labeled the box, Christmas decorations, fragile with a black marker. It was a mundane label, one Robert would never question if he saw it. On Thursday morning, while he was at work, Bea arrived in her van. We carried the box and 2 others like it out to the vehicle. She drove them to her brother-in-law's warehouse unit. The first physical movement was complete. On Friday, Ms. Jenkins called to confirm the temporary restraining order had been granted and filed. The specified accounts were frozen. The notice of Lee's pendants was on the house title. The legal machinery was now an active, invisible force. Robert had not yet noticed. His focus was on his own endgame, now 6 days away. That evening, I decided to cook his favorite meal. It was a ritual from earlier, better years: beef bourguignon with roasted potatoes, a simple green salad, and a chocolate torte for dessert. I did not do it out of nostalgia. I did it as an exercise in control. I needed to observe him in this state of ignorant confidence one last time. I needed the memory of his patronizing smile to fuel the final stages of my plan. I began in the afternoon, searing the meat, sautéing the vegetables, adding the red wine and broth. The kitchen filled with rich, savory smells. I set the dining room table with our good china, the set we had received as a wedding gift. I used the silverware that had been my mother's. I lit 2 tall, white candles in the crystal holders I had not yet packed away. Robert came home at 7. He hung his coat in the hallway and followed the scent to the kitchen. "Something smells incredible," he said, sounding pleasantly surprised. He came up behind me and placed a brief hand on my waist, peering into the pot. "Beef bourguignon, what's the occasion?" "No occasion," I said, stirring the stew gently. "I had the time. I remembered you always liked it." He smiled, that self-satisfied curve of his mouth. "I do. A classic." He poured himself a glass of whiskey from the decanter in the living room. "Tough week at work, nearing the finish line on a big project. This is a nice way to unwind." "I'm glad," I said, my voice neutral. I did not ask about the project, I knew. We sat down to eat 15 minutes later. The candlelight softened the edges of the room, glinting off the silver and crystal. It looked like a scene from a magazine, a picture of marital contentment. He took a bite of the stew and made an appreciative sound. "Perfect. As always, Elle, you really have a gift for this." "Thank you," I said, cutting a small piece of meat. "It's nice to have this," he said, gesturing vaguely with his fork. "The calm before the storm, you know. My project is about to hit a very active phase. I might be distracted next week. Traveling, perhaps." "I understand," I said. "A project of this scale requires focus." "Exactly." He took a sip of his wine. "It's taken years of planning, meticulous, quiet work, but the payoff will be worth it, a complete reset." He looked at me, his eyes reflecting the candle flames. "You've always been so supportive of my work, even when you didn't understand the details. I've always appreciated that." The irony was so thick I could almost touch it. I took a sip of water. "I believe in seeing things through to the end. especially plans that have been so carefully laid. "That's my girl," he said, the patronizing tone clear. He reached across the table and patted my hand. His touch was cool and dry. "Don't you worry about a thing. Everything is under control." "I'm not worried, Robert," I said, looking directly at him. I allowed a small, serene smile to touch my lips. "I have every confidence that things will turn out exactly as they should." He misinterpreted my smile entirely, taking it for wifely devotion. He squeezed my hand before letting go. "That's the spirit." We finished the main course. I cleared the plates and brought out the chocolate torte. He ate 2 slices, talking about a golf game he had planned for Sunday, about a new car model Tim was thinking of buying. His words were the buzzing of a fly against a window pane. I nodded at the appropriate moments, making small, noncommittal sounds. After dessert, he leaned back in his chair, patting his stomach. "A magnificent meal, Aliner. Truly, you've outdone yourself." "It was my pleasure," I said. He stood, picking up his whiskey glass. "I think I'll go over some final figures in the study. Don't wait up." "Of course," I said. He left the dining room. I heard the study door close. I remained at the table for a moment, looking at the empty chair across from me, the used silverware, the half-empty wine glass. The perfect candle-lit scene was a stage set. He had played his part, the benevolent patriarch, the shrewd planner on the cusp of victory. I had played mine, the supportive, oblivious wife. I stood and began to clear the table. I washed the dishes by hand, feeling the warm water on my skin. I wiped down the counters. I extinguished the candles. The house returned to its normal state of quiet. As I passed the closed study door on my way upstairs, I heard the faint tap of his keyboard. He was, I knew, checking account balances, confirming transfer dates, reassuring himself of his control. He would see nothing amiss tonight. The frozen accounts would not reveal themselves until he attempted to move the money. The legal notices were likely sitting in a stack of unopened mail at his office, or had been delivered to our home mailbox, which I had emptied that afternoon. I went to my bedroom. I did not feel triumph. I felt a cold, clean certainty. The Last Supper was over. The performance was concluded. The next act would not involve candles or china. It would involve the consequences of his actions meeting the wall of my preparations. I slept soundly that night. The calm before the storm, as he had called it, was indeed a real thing, but he was mistaken about which of us was experiencing it. The unraveling began on Monday morning. I was in the kitchen, washing the breakfast dishes. Robert had taken his coffee into his study earlier, stating he had critical transfers to initiate for the Cartwright project. The house was quiet except for the sound of water and the clink of china. Then I heard it, a sharp, frustrated exhale from behind the closed study door. It was followed by the rapid clicking of his computer mouse, then a low, muttered curse. I continued washing a plate, rinsing the soap suds under warm water. I dried my hands on a towel. The phone in his study rang. He answered it on the first ring. His voice was tense. "Tim, I'm glad you called. I'm trying to initiate the primary transfer now, and the system is giving me an error. It says the transaction cannot be processed at this time." I moved to the kitchen table and sat down with a cup of tea. I had a clear view of the hallway leading to the study. The door remained closed, but his voice carried. "What do you mean, you got something?" Robert's tone shifted from frustration to sharp inquiry. "What kind of notice?" There was a long pause. I could picture Tim on the other end speaking rapidly. Robert's responses became short, clipped. "A restraining order, on which accounts, all of them, that's impossible. She wouldn't even know." "No, she hasn't said a word." Another pause. His voice dropped, but it was no less intense. "The house, too. A what? A Lee's Pendens. What the hell is that?" I took a slow sip of my tea. The peppermint was soothing. "How could this happen without me knowing?" he demanded. His voice rose slightly. "I check the mail. Wait." His voice cut off. I heard the creak of his chair. He must have been checking something on his computer. "The joint line is frozen. The savings account alert I set. It's showing a 0 available balance. That's not right. That's not right at all." The panic was entering his voice now, a thin, sharp edge beneath the anger. "This has to be a mistake. A bank error. I need to call them right now. No, don't do anything. Don't talk to anyone. Let me handle this. He hung up. I heard the rapid dialing of another number. He spoke to someone at the bank, his voice straining to sound authoritative. This is Robert Montgomery. I'm trying to access account ending in 4491. I'm getting an error. I see. A court order. Can you tell me who filed it? You can't. On whose authority? I understand. Thank you. The call ended. There was a long, heavy silence from the study. Then, the sound of something being slammed onto the desk. A paperweight, perhaps. I finished my tea. The study door opened. Robert stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly curdling into anger. He saw me sitting at the kitchen table. He stared at me for a full 5 seconds, as if trying to reconcile the image of his wife with the catastrophic information he had just received. "Alina," he said, his voice tight, have you checked the mail lately?" I looked at him calmly. "I brought it in yesterday. It's on the console table in the hall. I haven't sorted through it all yet. Was there something important?" He blinked. "I don't know, maybe." He walked past me down the hall to the console. He grabbed the stack of mail and began flipping through it roughly. Bills, catalogs, charity solicitations. He found a long, business-sized envelope with a legal return address. It was addressed to him. His name was printed clearly. He tore it open. I watched as he scanned the first page. His breath hitched. His fingers tightened on the paper, crumpling the edges. He read it again, his lips moving slightly. It was the notice from the court regarding the temporary restraining order. Ms. Jenkins had said he would be served formally at his office, but a courtesy copy had been mailed to the house. This is about our accounts," he said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. He looked up at me, his eyes searching my face for any sign of knowledge of guilt. "It says they're frozen, by court order, due to a filing by an attorney, Jenkins." I allowed a faint, appropriate look of concern to cross my features. "That sounds serious. Is everything all right with the business?" "This isn't about the business," he snapped, then immediately tried to rein himself in. He took a breath. "This is about our personal accounts. Our money, someone has taken legal action against me, against us." "Who would do that?" I asked, my tone one of innocent confusion. "I don't know," he said, the frustration boiling over. He ran a hand through his hair, making it stand on end. "This doesn't make any sense, unless—" He stopped. He looked at me again, a new, terrible thought occurring to him. His eyes narrowed. "Have you spoken to a lawyer recently, Alina?" The question hung in the air. I met his gaze without flinching. "I haven't spoken to a lawyer since we updated our wills, Robert. That was years ago." This was technically true. I had not spoken to Ms. Jenkins until after I had retained her. The retainer was a transaction, not a conversation. He held my gaze for a moment longer, then looked back at the paper, shaking his head. "It must be a competitor or a disgruntled client, someone trying to sabotage the Cartwright deal. It has to be." He was talking himself back into a framework he understood, business warfare. It was easier than the alternative. "I'm sure you'll sort it out," I said, standing up and taking my cup to the sink. "You always do." He didn't respond. He was already heading back to his study, the legal notice clutched in his hand. He closed the door. I heard the low murmur of his voice as he called Tim back, then another call, probably to a different lawyer, a man he used for business matters who would be unfamiliar with domestic financial restraining orders. I rinsed my cup. The unraveling had begun. The first thread had been pulled. His smug certainty was now fractured by confusion and a low-grade, seeping fear. He was in the dark, fumbling for a light switch that I had already removed from the wall. I felt no pity. I felt the cold satisfaction of a plan proceeding exactly as outlined. Phase 2 was complete. The trap was sprung. He just didn't know yet what or who had set it. He spent the rest of Monday on the phone, a low, frantic buzz emanating from his study. I heard him arguing with someone, likely his business lawyer, about jurisdictional issues, about emergency motions, about the meaning of Elise pendants. His voice was a mixture of bluster and bewilderment. I tended to my garden. The hydrangeas needed deadheading. The peace lily by the fence needed watering. The work was methodical and quiet. By Tuesday evening, his confusion had hardened into a simmering, suspicious anger. The business lawyer had apparently explained the nature of the restraining order in terms he could no longer dismiss as a corporate attack. This was a domestic filing. It required knowledge of our personal finances. It required intent. I was in the living room, reading a book. The sun had set, and the room was lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows. The large mirror above the fireplace reflected the room back in a soft, dusky gloom. Robert stood in the doorway, watching me for a moment before he spoke. "Eleanor, we need to talk." I placed a bookmark between the pages and set the book on the side table. "Of course, what is it?" He walked into the room but did not sit. He paced a short path in front of the fireplace, his hands shoved into his pockets. "This situation with the accounts, it's becoming a major problem." "I gathered that from your calls," I said, my voice neutral. He stopped packing and turned to face me. "My lawyer says this kind of order doesn't come out of nowhere. It requires evidence, documentation. Someone had to provide a lot of detailed information about our finances to this Jenkins person." "That sounds logical," I said. His eyes narrowed. "The only people who have that kind of detailed information are you and me, and I certainly didn't file it." I waited, saying nothing. I let the silence stretch. It pressed against his agitation. "Have you been going through my office?" he asked, his tone attempting to be casual but failing. "Maybe organizing things. You might have moved some papers, accidentally given something to the wrong person. A statement, perhaps." I looked at him directly. In the dim light, our eyes met in the mirror's reflection before meeting in reality. Two images, side by side, connected and yet profoundly separate. "I do not go into your office, Robert. You've always preferred your privacy there. I respect that." "But you handle the mail," he pressed, taking a step closer. "You could have seen something, opened something by mistake. Maybe you got scared by a letter from the bank and called someone for help without telling me." He was fabricating a narrative now, one where I was a foolish, frightened woman who had inadvertently triggered a legal disaster. It was easier for him to believe in my incompetence than in my capability. "I have opened no mail addressed to you," I stated, each word clear and distinct. "If I had seen something concerning, I would have brought it to you immediately. That has always been our understanding." He ran a hand over his face. The frustration was palpable. "Then how did this happen? Someone accessed our private financial records. Someone knew about the Cartwright holdings. That's not public information, Eleanor." His voice rose slightly on my name, an accusation he couldn't quite form. I continued to look at him, my gaze steady. I did not blink. I let him see the absolute calm on my face, a calm that stood in stark contrast to his unraveling nerves. I said nothing. The silence seemed to scream at him. "What do you know?" he finally demanded, the question bursting out of him. "You're sitting there so quietly. What aren't you saying?" I tilted my head just a fraction. "I know that you are upset. I know that there are legal complications you did not anticipate. Beyond that, I know only what you have told me." He stared at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something beyond anger in his eyes. It was a dawning, chilling doubt. He was looking at the woman he had lived with for 30 years, and he was not seeing the placid, predictable wife he thought he knew. He was seeing a surface of impenetrable calm, and it terrified him because he could not see what lay beneath it. "Everything is as it should be, Robert," I said, my voice low and even. The phrase, so simple, so benign, seemed to strike him like a physical blow. He took a slight step back. His mouth opened, then closed. He searched my face for irony, for malice, for any clue. He found nothing but serene assurance. "What does that mean?" he whispered. "It means precisely what it says," I replied. I picked up my book again, a clear signal that the conversation, from my perspective, was over. "The legal system will work as it does. Your lawyers will advise you. These things have a way of resolving themselves." He stood there, frozen, for another long moment. He looked from me to our reflection in the mirror, a man coming undone, standing beside a woman of unshakable composure. The image was a truth he could no longer avoid. Without another word, he turned and left the room. His footsteps were heavy on the stairs. A few moments later, I heard the door to his study slam shut. I did not reopen my book. I sat in the quiet living room, watching the light fade completely in the mirror. The direct confrontation had occurred. He had asked the question, and I had given him an answer that answered nothing, yet told him everything he needed to suspect. The seed of knowing was planted in his mind. It would grow now, in the dark of his panic, into a terrible, clarifying understanding. He was no longer just fighting a legal mystery. He was starting to fear he was fighting me. And for the first time, he had no idea how to win. The night after our conversation in the living room, the house felt different. It was not a physical change, but a shift in atmosphere. Robert remained in his study until very late. I went to bed at my usual time. I heard him come upstairs around 2 in the morning. His footsteps were slow and heavy. He did not come into our bedroom, he went to the guest room. The silence that followed was thick and unresolved. The next morning, Wednesday, I rose early. I moved through my routine with practiced ease. I was in the kitchen making coffee when Robert appeared. He looked like he had not slept. His clothes were wrinkled from the day before. He had not shaved. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, staring out at the garden without seeing it. "My lawyer is coming over at 9, he said, his voice hoarse. "He needs to see the papers from the court, the ones that were mailed here. Have you seen them?" "They are on the console table where you left them," I said. He grunted. He took a sip of coffee, wincing at the heat. "This is a nightmare, a complete, inexplicable nightmare." I did not respond. I buttered a piece of toast. At 8:45, the doorbell rang. Robert jumped, spilling coffee on his shirt. He cursed, setting the mug down hard. "That's early." I walked to the front door. It was not his lawyer. A man in a uniform stood on the doorstep, holding a large, thick envelope. "Delivery for Robert Montgomery," he said. "I will see that he gets it," I said. "I need to hand it directly to him, ma'am, or to a responsible adult at this address. Are you Alina Montgomery?" "I am." "Then I can release it to you. Please sign here." He handed me a digital pad. I signed my name. He gave me the envelope. It was heavy, official. The return address was from Ms. Jenkins's firm. "Have a good day," he said, and left. I closed the door. Robert was already in the hallway, his eyes fixed on the envelope in my hands. "What is that?" "It is for you," I said, handing it to him. "It was just delivered." He took it, his fingers fumbling with the clasp. He tore it open and pulled out a thick sheaf of papers. The top page had a case number and a heading. "Petition for legal separation and support. Motion for temporary orders. EXHIBITS A through K." His face lost all its color. He leaned against the wall for support as his eyes scanned the first page, then the second. This is from her, from that lawyer." He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a horror that was now fully formed. "She's filing for separation. She's claiming financial misconduct, constructive abandonment. She's asking for everything." He flipped through the pages, his movements becoming more frantic. "Exhibits, what exhibits?" He turned to the back of the packet. There were copies of the documents from my ledger, the credit card statements, the bank transfers, the emails about Cartwright. Each was neatly labeled. A cover sheet stated, "Documentary evidence of respondent, secret financial planning and intent to divest marital assets." His breath came in short, sharp gasps. "These are my private papers. These are from my study, from my computer." His head snapped up. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, locked onto mine. The last veil of doubt was gone. You did this, you took these, you gave them to a lawyer." I met his gaze. I said nothing. My silence was my confession and my verdict. "How long," he whispered, the words raw, "how long have you been planning this?" "Longer than you," I said, my voice calm and clear in the quiet hallway. The sound that escaped him was something between a groan and a choke. He slumped against the wall, the papers crinkling in his clenched fists. "You've ruined me. You've taken everything. The accounts are frozen. The house is tied up. She's even asking for my business shares as part of the asset division. This will destroy me." I turned and walked away from him, down the hall toward the guest room. He did not follow. I could hear him sinking to the floor, the papers scattering around him. In the guest room closet, I had placed a single empty suitcase 2 days prior. I brought it out and set it on the bed. I opened it. I went to the master bedroom and opened his dresser. I began to select items: socks, underwear, t-shirts. I chose practical, basic things. I did not pack his suits or his favorite sweaters. I packed enough for a week, perhaps 2. I folded each item neatly and placed it in the suitcase. I carried the suitcase downstairs. He was still sitting on the floor in the hallway, surrounded by the legal papers, his head in his hands. I set the suitcase upright by the front door. The click of the handle locking into place made him look up. He stared at the suitcase, then at me. His expression was one of utter incomprehension. "What is that?" "It's for you," I said. "You're kicking me out?" he asked, his voice hollow. "The papers you are holding outline my claims and my requests," I said. "One of those requests is for exclusive use of the marital home during the proceedings. It is standard. Given the circumstances, I believe it is appropriate for you to find other accommodations. Your things, or what remains of them, will be made available to you once arrangements are formalized." He looked from the suitcase to the devastating pages in his hand, then back to me. The full scope of the counterattack was now laid bare before him. It was legal, it was financial, and it was personal. His plan had not just been stopped, it had been dismantled and used as the foundation for his own defeat. "You can't do this," he said, but the words had no force. They were a plea, not a statement. "It is already done, Robert," I said. I turned and walked back toward the kitchen. I had my own preparations to complete. The gathering storm was no longer gathering. It had arrived, and I was standing calmly in its eye while he was being swept away by the winds he thought he controlled. He did not leave immediately. He took the suitcase, yes, but he moved like a man in a dream, shuffling out the door after his lawyer arrived and held a hushed, urgent conference with him on the front porch. They left together in the lawyer's car. I watched from the living room window. Robert did not look back at the house. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of purpose. I had one final night in the house, one final period of preparation before the last physical act of reclamation. I did not sleep in our bedroom. I slept in the guest room, on sheets I would leave behind. I rose at 5 in the morning on Thursday. The house was dark and still. This was the day his original plan was to reach its climax. He was to have been on a plane, the accounts drained. Instead, he was likely in a hotel room or on Tim's couch, scrambling with his lawyer to respond to the mountain of paper I had unleashed. I showered and dressed with deliberate care. I put on the cream-colored suit. I styled my silver-gray hair. I applied a subtle lipstick. I looked in the mirror. I saw a woman in command of herself, poised on the edge of a new life. I went downstairs. The suitcase was gone from the foyer, but I had a different one ready. A small, hard-shelled roller bag stood by the back door, packed 2 days ago with a week's worth of my own clothes, my toiletries, my essential papers. This was not an escape. It was a transitional kit. I would not return here after today. The movers were scheduled for 9 o'clock. Bea had arranged them through her brother-in-law's contacts, a crew she vouched for discreet and efficient. They had the inventory list I had painstakingly compiled over the last week. They had the address of the storage unit and the new apartment I had leased the previous day, using my separate savings as a deposit. The apartment was furnished with items from the storage unit, items Bea and I had moved over the past 2 weeks. All that remained here were the large pieces, the furniture, the rugs, the art still on the walls. But first, there was the staging. I walked from room to room. The living room was as we had left it last night, the book I was reading still on the side table. I picked it up and placed it in a cardboard box labeled study books. I picked up the lamp from the same table and unplugged it, placing it in a box marked lamps. I folded the rug, a Persian piece I had found at an auction years ago, and carried it to the growing pile by the front door. I moved to the dining room. I took the remaining crystal candlesticks from the sideboard. I wrapped them in cloth and boxed them. I removed the paintings from the walls. I took the curtains down from their rods. The room began to echo. In the kitchen, I left the appliances. They were generic. But I took the good knives, the copper pots my mother had given me, the set of china from the wedding. I boxed the contents of the pantry that I had purchased. I left his favorite coffee, his expensive whiskey. I saved the bedroom for last. I stripped the bed of the linens I loved, leaving the mattress bare. I emptied my closet completely. Every dress, every pair of shoes, packed in garment bags and suitcases already waiting in B's van from our last trip. His side of the closet remained full, a museum of a life he would have to sort through later. I took the jewelry from my dresser, not the pearl earrings he gave me, but the pieces from my grandmother, the simple gold chain I wore every day. By 8 o'clock, the house was a shell of its former self. Boxes and furniture were stacked neatly in the living room and foyer, ready for the movers. The walls were bare. The floors were mostly clear of rugs. The rooms echoed with every step. I went out to the garden shed for the last time. I moved the piece lily. I opened the safe and took out the ledger. I placed it in my handbag. I closed the safe for the final time and did not replace the plant. I carried the piece lily back into the house, its pot cool and smooth in my hands. In the living room, now almost entirely empty, I had left a single item, a straight-backed wooden chair placed in the precise center of the space. It was a chair from the kitchen table, unremarkable. I set the piece lily on the seat of the chair. It was the only living thing left in the house. I walked to the foyer. I positioned my small suitcase by the door. I went into the kitchen and made a single cup of coffee in the machine I would leave behind. I poured it into a travel mug. I washed the carafe and left it upside down on the counter. I looked at the clock, 8:45. The movers would arrive in 15 minutes. B would be here in 10 to collect me and my final bag. I took my coffee and stood in the doorway of the living room. I surveyed the emptiness. The morning light streamed in through the bare windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. The house was no longer a home. It was a vessel I had emptied of my life, my care, my history. It was a canvas wiped clean. I felt no sadness. I felt a profound, ringing quiet. This was the elegant execution, not an act of violence, but an act of erasure. I was removing every trace of my presence, every object that held a memory I cherished, every comfort I had provided. I was leaving him with the architecture of a shared life, but none of its content. He had planned to leave me with an empty future. I was leaving him with an empty past. The doorbell rang. It was B. I took one last look at the empty living room, at the single chair and the plant upon it. Then I turned, picked up my suitcase, opened the front door, and walked out of the house without looking back. The mover's truck was just pulling up to the curb. The active phase was over. The reclamation was complete. All that remained was for him to discover what I had left in my wake. The movers worked with a swift, impersonal efficiency. B supervised from the sidewalk, directing them as they loaded the truck with the boxes and furniture I had staged. I did not watch. I sat in the passenger seat of her van, my small suitcase at my feet, and watched the neighborhood awake. A man walked his dog. A woman retrieved her newspaper. Life continued in its ordinary rhythm. My extraordinary act was just a minor disruption in the street's quiet morning. The truck pulled away. B got into the driver's seat. She looked at me, her face full of a triumphant energy she was trying to contain. "It's done," she said. "It's done," I agreed. We drove to my new apartment. It was in a modern, secure building downtown, not far from Ms. Jenkins's office. The movers were already there, unloading. I directed them as they placed each piece of furniture, each box, in the spaces I had predetermined. My Persian rug was laid in the living room. My books were placed on the shelves. My bed was made with the linens I loved. By noon, the apartment was not just furnished. It was my home. It held my history, my taste, my peace. There was no trace of Robert, no memory I had not chosen to bring with me. B helped me put the last things away. We hung art on the walls. We placed the crystal candlesticks on the mantel. At 1 o'clock, we stopped. The apartment was in order. "Now," B said, opening my refrigerator, which she had stocked the day before, "we celebrate." She pulled out a bottle of champagne and a carton of orange juice. I smiled. It was a real smile, one that felt unfamiliar on my face but perfectly right. "That sounds appropriate." She mixed 2 mimosas in my grandmother's crystal flutes. We sat on my sofa. which had once been in our living room but now looked entirely different here, in this light, in this context. We raised our glasses. To the quietest person in the room, Bea said, her eyes bright. To friendship, I replied. We drank. The champagne was crisp and clean. My phone, a new one with a new number that only Bea and Ms. Jenkins possessed, lay silent on the coffee table. The old phone was in a drawer in the empty house, its battery dead. I had no desire to know what was happening there, but I knew, with absolute certainty, what was occurring. Robert had been instructed by his lawyer to return to the house that afternoon to collect some personal effects. He had a key. He would let himself in. I pictured it. He would open the front door and step into the foyer. His footsteps, which usually met the soft resistance of the rug, would echo on the bare hardwood. He would call out, "Elle," out of habit. His voice would bounce off the walls unanswered. He would walk into the living room. He would stop. He would see the vast, empty space. The walls stripped of every painting and photograph. The floor naked without its rugs. The windows bare of curtains. The silence absolute and profound. And in the center of that void, the single wooden chair. And on the chair, the peace lily from the garden shed. It would be the only object in the entire first floor. A living, growing thing in the midst of nothingness. That is when he would scream. It would not be a shout of anger. It would be a raw, involuntary sound of utter disorientation and loss. The sound of a man who had finally grasped the magnitude of his miscalculation. He had planned to leave me with nothing. He had instead been left with everything he truly valued. Nothing. He would run through the house then, I imagine, up the stairs to the bedrooms. He would find his closet full, a mocking museum of his own belongings. He would find my closet empty, a clean sweep. He would find the master bedroom barren, a ghost of a shared life. He would stumble back downstairs, his breath coming in short gasps. He would find the legal papers, the ones he had dropped the day before, still scattered on the hallway floor where he had left them. A final reminder of the mechanism of his defeat. He would pick up his phone. He would dial my number. He would hear the automated message. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." He would call Bea. She would not answer. He would call anyone he thought might know me. No one would have information. He was sealed out of my life, as completely as if I had vanished. Bea's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it. "It's him," she said, showing me the screen. Robert's name flashed again and again. She silenced it and placed the phone face down. "He'll figure it out, or his lawyer will explain it to him again." I took another sip of my mimosa. I felt no urge to know what he was saying, what pleas or threats he was attempting to make. That chapter was closed. His panic, his despair, his frantic attempts to regain control, they were no longer my concern. They were the consequences of his own actions, arriving exactly on schedule. I looked around my new apartment. The afternoon sun slanted across my rug, warming the colors. My books lined the shelves. A painting of peonies, my favorite flower, hung on the wall. Everything in this space was mine, chosen by me, placed by me. There was no negotiation, no compromise, no silent resentment. There was only calm. "What will you do now?" Bea asked, her voice gentle. "I will finish my drink," I said. "Then I will unpack the kitchen boxes. Tomorrow I have an appointment with Ms. Jenkins to discuss the next steps in the separation agreement. Next week, I may join the Botanical Society's lecture series. I have many plans. None of them involve him." Bea smiled, a symphony of silence. "It is not silent here," I said, listening to the comfortable quiet of my own space. "It is peaceful." We finished our drinks. Bea hugged me tightly before she left, promising to check in tomorrow. I closed the door behind her. I stood in the center of my living room, in the home I had reclaimed piece by piece, strategy by strategy, year by year. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. The world was wide and full of possibilities. I had my health. I had my mind. I had my freedom. I had turned 30 years of patience into a victory so complete it required no fanfare, no confrontation, no raised voice. It required only the quiet, unwavering knowledge that I had seen the end from the beginning, and I had prepared. The reclamation was not just of objects or money. It was of myself. I was no longer Alina, the unassuming wife. I was Elle, the woman who had planned her own future and executed that plan with precision. I had taken the life he thought was his to discard and made it entirely, beautifully my own. I turned from the window. I had boxes to unpack, a new life to arrange. The story of my vengeance was over. The story of my life was just beginning.